Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Bernt-Santy. You all know who I am. Also today on the show is Mike Huber. Hello, Mike.
Hello.
Mike, what do you want people to know about you?
Yeah, I guess I always forget to mention things about me, but I do have a book called Inclusion Includes Us that came out just a few months ago. And I still have the book Embracing Rough and Tumble Play if
Yeah,
people want the oldies too.
the classic Mike,
Yeah,
as opposed to modern Mike. Yeah, they're
exactly.
both really great books. I think everybody knows that I think that because I've mentioned it so many times. So definitely, and your podcast, you have your own podcast.
Oh, yeah. Teaching with the Body and Mind. You
Yeah.
can get our ratings up higher than Heather's if you go and listen.
Fight. Also joining us is Anna McRae. Hi, Anna.
Hi, everyone.
And she's here for the very first time, so we know that we want to hear more about you.
Yes, I am so happy to be here. I realize I have like no social media presence. I have not written any books, but I got an invite from Mike, so I must have some sort of potential.
Highly recommended by Mike Huber. You can put that on your.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
So I am here because I do love to talk about early childhood. Most of my professional background is in early childhood mental health, specifically in autism therapy, which I have sort of a good, the bad, and the ugly relationship with. But I'm very excited about today's subject matter for that very reason. Presently, I am working as Director of Inclusion, Curriculum, and Quality at St. David's Center Early Childhood Education Program. I supervise graduate level social workers in an autism day treatment program and provide mental health consultation to one of our local school districts in their early childhood program. So I joke that like if a child under the age of 5, pull someone's hair, they call me in, I get to watch it happen, and tell them that their hair must be a really great texture. Their hair pulled regularly. So.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, welcome. I'm glad we've been talking about doing this episode for so long that all of us kind of forgot what we were going to talk about by the time we had an episode scheduled.
Yeah.
By the time we had this scheduled, I was embarrassed to admit to you, Anna, that I didn't remember what the topic was going to be. So I texted Mike singly outside of our group email. And then I was really relieved when you also emailed. You're like, okay, so what was the gist of what we're going to talk about?
I've had a lot of conversations where he said like, this is what the podcast will be. And so I was like, I'm going to need to just get a little refresher on which specific, because we talk a lot.
It's true.
Yeah, nice. Well, good. I'm glad you're both here. We're going to start with a quote that is actually kind of a story from Greg Santucci. He's an occupational therapist. And if you haven't seen any of his stuff on Facebook and Instagram, I think he's on Instagram, and he has a website. It's really good. It's really been both validating and eye-opening for me. Like there's a lot that I've been thinking, yes, I just didn't have the words for that instinct about, autism especially. So anyway, we're going to start with this story and then we'll see where our conversation goes as early childhood folks, and you bring the therapist piece into the conversation for us. Okay, so Greg says, I was working in a classroom for children with autism, an ABA classroom. It was a new school day early in the year and it was time for the morning meeting. However, one little girl wasn't feeling it that day and she was having a tough morning. That didn't matter to the adults in the room. It was time for morning meeting, period. The little girl was led to her plastic cube chair by her paraprofessional who sat behind her, coaching her and containing her. As morning meeting continued with the attendance, the days of the weeks, months of the year, hours of the day, the almanac, the horoscopes, and everything else they cover, it was time to quote unquote do the weather. That was this little girl's task. The para tried to lift her up out of the cube chair, but she resisted, falling to the ground. As the para tried to pick her up, she resisted further. This was unacceptable to the teacher. God, I hate the word unacceptable. That was outside of the quote. I'm going back in now. This was unacceptable to the teacher, who instructed the para to keep placing the demand on her and don't let her be quote, comfortable on the floor. The para did what she was told. She stood over the little girl and repeated, do the weather ad nauseum. Do the weather, 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 do the weather. This little girl would not comply, so a large blue bin of Legos was dumped on the floor. Now crying, the little girl was told to pick the Legos up. All the while, the para continued, do the weather, do the weather, do the weather. They were not going to, quote, let her win. They were going to get her to comply. Eventually, they broke her. And this is what so many ABA stories sound like to me when I see and read them. And I want to cry, and I'm angry, and I don't understand how we get here with young children. I mean, with any other human, but with the ages that we're working with in our early childhood programs, it's astonishing to me. Somebody else talk while I get a hold of myself.
Well, so Anna, I've heard you talk about, when you're working with people, you kind of have them watch some videos of ABA, I think you said, just so they can see, like, yeah, I'm not making this up. People do this.
Yeah, I love to use scare tactics in supervision to keep my supervisees ethical.
Nice.
So, and it is like a recently adapted skill that I will show people videos of ABA, because I am finding that our more like recent sort of generation of autism therapists really know about neuroplasticity. So they sort of understand this idea that when we are doing things that we enjoy, we're more likely to learn more.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are like, they're surprised and confused by how these very like compliance-based models have gained as much traction as they have. But, I think therapeutically, as an adult human in relationship with children who challenge us, the desire for power and control is something that like we've all felt.
Mm-hmm.
ABA can be a real example of where that goes really wrong. And I want people to sort of see some of that play out and to be like, so if you have that instinct just to like really hold that boundary with a child, just take pause.
Mm-hmm.
Because, we know that actually we don't do our best learning when we're super stressed and somebody's breathing down our necks.
Mm-hmm.
Just humans in general we're not big fans of that kind of learning.
Right. And there's so many times when I hear people say, well, at work, would you want someone doing that to you at work if you weren't meeting a performance goal or something? And, people are really willing to admit that, yeah, in an adult relationship, that would be really out of line. But there's something about, it's probably the power, it's probably the idea that we're supposed to be teaching and doing something to the child to reach goals. But there's just a something missing in there, and we can't make that same connection when we're talking about adults and children that we do.
It's almost like the learning supersedes the idea of relationship, right?
What?
That this thing is so important.
Yeah.
You really have to know how to count to 7 or 10 or whatever, that I don't care if I'm mean to you, or, and I wouldn't think of it as mean because the end justifies the means, right?
Right.
I think that's partly what that is.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember an early childhood professor talking about a student she had that worked at an ABA therapy center, and talking about a story kind of like this. And the student was late for class because she couldn't leave until the student did whatever they were supposed to do. And that was this college student's reason for being late for class. And the professor was like, and I just thought that was so neat. What are you talking about? How is that neat? But it feels like you're doing something about a problem, I think, is where that came for her.
I would have much rather heard, I'm late because this child needed me.
Yeah.
And I was there as they calmed down.
Yeah.
I don't know, like,
right.
Maybe I'm old fashioned.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I just, I don't know. It doesn't seem like something I could do, but I don't know, maybe earlier in my career, if I'd been in a different spot, that this, and I came across this, maybe I'd think differently, but it's just really hard for me.
It's so
to look at
interesting.
that.
I was never in an ABA proper program, but I was in programs that were sort of ABA light. And I think about how, I think when I was trained in initially, this was like 12 years ago. We didn't know as much about brain development. And I think the way that we conceptualized autism, or, you know, historically, the conceptualization of autism has also been like very tightly knit with eugenics. And so the idea that like, oh, these children are distressed and really need us to like mold them, I think was more prevalent. I think it's
they
still
need structure.
Yes. Yeah. We have to offer.
Yeah.
And then there was this idea that even if I was co-regulating with a child, that distress was how children learn. So that was like the early messaging for me, was like, you just got to help them push through it, because that's how they're going to learn that they can do it. So you say, do the weather, do the weather, do the weather, do the weather. And eventually they figure out that they can do the weather. What was missing there was that like we were sending children into total fight or flight level distress, where if eventually they did learn to do the weather, it was because of repetition and, I don't know, path of least resistance, like learning trauma, not because they're really learning to do the weather.
Yeah. Does this get you to stop? Then I'll do the weather if you will stop.
Exactly. And then, you know, coming, you know, down the line, I think I learned the research to sort of match the emotional experience that was like, oh, this is why this feels so bad.
Right. It's like doing the weather is the maladaptive behavior they take on to stop the trauma, right? I mean, I don't know if I have the terminology right exactly, but like it's this weird thing that we usually think of trauma as being somebody, well, I shouldn't say, because it is exactly this, somebody abusing someone.
Yeah.
And yet the abuse is coming from the therapist.
Yeah.
And certainly most adults with autistic adults that I know or that I read use that word abuse.
Yes.
And I do remember, actually, it was like a they must have been in 7th grade. It was the first time that opened my eyes, where they referred to Autism Speaks as a hate group.
Yeah, I've heard that one
and
too.
that they're, you know, and it was just so interesting having a 7th grader. And they actually did a report in class in 7th grade about why it qualifies as a hate group. And it was just so interesting that a 7th grader could articulate that.
Yeah.
And yet we have adults that can't.
Yeah, we may need to talk about that now, because there may be people listening who have never heard that viewpoint or that that way of thinking. So what I know about Autism Speaks and is that there aren't a lot of autistic voices involved in their work, and they've autistic people have asked for that change, to be on the board and to be in the positions of decision making, and that hasn't been really forthcoming. But also the approach is this is something we need to cure, and autistic folks don't feel like they need to be cured. Right. So that's my level of understanding about why Autism Speaks is problematic.
That's also my level of understanding about why Autism Speaks.
Yeah.
And I think autistic people are kind of like done with trying to be like change Autism Speaks, and rather just trying to help other neurotypicals know that don't give them money, don't, you know, deal with them. That's now, I mean, certainly the tactic, but shoot, I was going to ask Anna something. No, I forgot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just think it's that idea that this is a group that's out there saying, we're here to help fix you, and not listening to the people saying, we are okay. We would like to see some work on the other folks. Let's fix some other folks so that I can live in this world safely and comfortably and healthily. But the message continues to be, no, you need to be fixed. You need to be cured.
And it's fascinating to me because I think there's a bridge between this, there is a solution to, I think, what sort of the Cure Autism community is trying to point at. That isn't about curing or ridding the world of autism. It's about reducing distress. So when I look at that and I look at, the sort of language around like, oh, these people are suffering, like, look at these suffering. Have I worked with children who are suffering? Absolutely. It is extremely painful to not be able to express yourself and to be living in a world that is overstimulating and exhausting to your nervous system and your sensory system. Like, absolutely. Does that mean you shouldn't exist?
Right.
And no one obviously is saying like, get rid of this specific child, but, and does that mean that like, we're sort of done with the conversation? Clearly this child is distressed, so there should be no more children like this. Like, absolutely not. And so I think like, can we invest our energy in looking at how do we create a more hospitable world for neurodivergence? And also, how do we reduce stress in the meantime?
Right.
Let's stop containing children who are visibly stressed out.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be contained when they're stressed.
Yeah, and that term contained, I think, is just so, because so perhaps, I mean, we've talked about co-regulation on this podcast before, but I think getting, if you don't mind, Anna, you explaining co-regulation from your perspective, because I think it is different in the classroom. So I guess we didn't say this, but Anna's my boss. So we often talk about.
So this is Mike's chance to boss Anna around on the show.
No, but I mean, we talk a lot about the way, like, what a classroom teacher goes through versus a therapist, and how there's differences in that. Teachers with a child for an extended day or several hours, and most therapists, I guess ABA sometimes
30 hours a week. That's what insurance wants.
But there's a difference, I think, in terms of what you're doing. But anyways, that's an aside. But co-regulation, what the hell is it?
What is it? So the way I think about co-regulation, particularly with children, is this idea that the way that adult approaches a distressed child has an impact on that child's ability to learn to regulate. And so the same principles apply to an adult-adult relationship that apply to a child-adult relationship, where like children are more likely to be able to soothe if they have someone who is calm themselves, supportive themselves, validating. If you think about, who do you call at the end of a really stressful work day? Do you call somebody who's going to say like, oh, well, it sounds like you should have. Or somebody who's going to say, you really just need to sit down.
Yeah.
Going to yell at you.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to tell you just to get it together. We don't call those people. Or sometimes we do. And then we're like, oh, that didn't feel good at all. And so to translate it to children, when a child is distressed, they need the same things that we do as adults, which is like someone to validate the experience, someone to be in it with us, but not get totally lost in it. So like, this is really hard. What can we do? What do you need? So I think about co-regulation sort of as those features of a relationship that allow you to self-soothe and also soothe with the comfort of a supportive partner.
Yeah.
I
don't know if that's what I've said before, Mike. Who knows what I've said.
I don't think so, but I was just realizing that Heather and I co-regulate a lot via text. Whenever something happens, it's like, oh, I got it.
Yeah.
Mike will tell me I'm right.
Or I'll tell you, that's really difficult.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think for so many people in early childhood, at least, they hear self-regulation or they hear regulation, and what they process that as is obedience and compliance. Like a child who can self-regulate, that means he follows my rules or she does what I need her to do, or she manages her emotions, in a way that's not inconvenient for me. And that's self-regulation.
I always use the example of being in a car with a loved one, a spouse, especially, and something happens, as you're driving and, you like swear and they say, it's no big deal, or, don't get mad.
Yeah.
And it's like, is that ever helpful? And it's what we do to kids all the time. Like, that's an example of forcing your regulation onto the person.
Yeah.
And it never works for us.
No.
We hold children to such a higher standard than we are willing to be held to ourselves as adults. And, everybody has bad days. That's not what I'm talking about. Just sort of generally speaking, in our, the systems we've put in place for young children, they're expected to do a lot of things that we don't do ourselves. And if we do make a mistake, we have this, we have a good rationale, and we have an opportunity to present our rationale, and we aren't willing to always extend that to children.
Well, and the thing that's like, I was just having this conversation with another coworker this afternoon, because we were talking about a staff member that we both work with, who is saying about this child, like, she's always trying to figure out how to get adults how to help her.
Yeah. Oh, rats, what a terrible child.
It's like, children actually famously do that all the time.
Yeah.
It's infuriating, I know. And she's 4.
Yeah.
But the genius in that, despite it being infuriating for adults everywhere, is that, like, children don't learn how to do stuff generally without some degree of support from adults. And so usually if they really can't regulate, they're showing you how much support they need to learn, and they're showing what they don't yet know. Eventually they can do it independently. And my standards for adult regulation are much higher, because you've had plenty of opportunity to learn. And you have, a fully developed brain. So, like, your impulse control and your ability to regulate, really,
even if that is, you make the excuse to go, like, leave for a little while. Like, I need to go, like, leave for 15 minutes or whatever.
Yeah,
totally.
Yeah. So that, when you were talking about both what you just said, and then also when you were talking about co-regulation earlier, it brought to mind something that's a big part of ABA, but also just general, positive behavior intervention support, whatever that is, PBIS, and just general behavior kinds of advice and guidance people get, is that planned ignoring or intentional ignoring. If you think they're just trying to get your attention, don't give it to them. We can't just let them tell us when they get attention. But what you're saying is that attention is what helps co-regulate, right? That's what they need. And if we really want them to do better or feel better, that's our role.
Yeah. And it's not, and we're not providing attention, it's not a 0 to 100 game. It's really a question of, like, okay, how much support do you need right now? What do I know that you are able to do yourself? What do I know you can't do? And where can I meet you in the middle, right? It's all about scaffolding. And we know educationally, we know how to help kids scaffold, but we don't always apply the same principles to emotional regulation. But I think the message that I hear a lot from educators who are overwhelmed is, like, very understandably, if I give them all this attention now, like, how is he ever going to learn? And then I say, like, and you have the power to, like, turn it up and turn it back down a little bit, as you see that a child is showing you they're able to do it independently. But they're never going to get there if we give them nothing when they're showing they can't do something.
Yeah. I was thinking about it and kind of comparing it to a baby learning to walk. Like, we're so ready to support everything they need, that we're giving them supports they don't need, because we're so anxious. We're putting them in standing things and holding them up on their feet and walking them around. But the minute they start pulling up, we're all about it. And the minute they start kind of taking a few steps, we're right there to catch them if they're going to fall, and making sure that everything around them is safe. And when
they fall, we don't yell at them.
Right.
Like, what are you doing?
Do the walking, do the walking, do the walking.
Do the walking.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that is, it's I mean, a 4-year-old is only 4 years old, like that's, because I
48
mean,
months.
even a 9-year-old who like is asking for help, it's because they need help,
Yeah.
and I think learning that they can't ask for help, that's called neglect, right? If you try to condition them to not ask for help when they need help, like that also doesn't seem ethical.
But we label that as an ability to self-soothe when really they've just sort of given up trying to get help.
Yeah.
And I don't think those two things are the same thing either. I don't think
Right.
that's necessarily self-soothing.
And I think I'm going to make this statement and then feel free to contradict me, but
Deal.
just from reading, it seems that like AFAB individuals, so assigned female at birth, who are autistic, don't get diagnosed to adulthood, we'll talk about they were that self-soothing, quiet child. It's more typical in autistic people who are assigned female. And I think it is one of those ones. It's one of the like, whatever, it doesn't fit the stereotype of autism. Like, well, they're fine. And therefore you don't do anything for them. And yet they're also struggling. They're also needing help, but they've learned to not ask for it because adults don't provide that. So
Yeah, where I am not, I can't remember the like precise research, but I think what I have read that you're pointing to is like we're just really bad at identifying communication delays in girls because quote, girls, end quote.
Yeah.
Because we just assign it to temperament. We say, oh, she's just quiet.
right.
And if little boys, end quote, are quiet, there must be something wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
He should be yelling.
Yeah.
Doesn't he the man in the world?
Yeah, it's interesting how stereotypes about gender as well as stereotypes about what autism is like come into play with how we treat it.
Yeah. Can we go backwards for a minute? Because we jumped right in also assuming that everybody knew the ABA research we're talking about. We've all kind of talked about,
or even what ABA is,
or what ABA is. Yeah. So nutshell, ABA is applied behavior analysis. And it's like the story you heard at the beginning. Feel free to add, therapist Anna, on what ABA,
Yeah.
What would you call it? But it's the main autism treatment that insurance will pay for. So it's like the most widely used, I know, approach to working with kids with autism.
The way that I will describe it to the untrained eye sounds really scathing, and I both intend it to be scathing and I mostly intend it to be illustrative, which is like a lot of basic principles of like dog training sort of apply here. We reinforce behaviors that we want to see. So we give you something you want when we ask you for something and you demonstrate it to us. And if you don't demonstrate it to us, we withhold it from you. It's very simple principles of behavior that are actually quite useful as long as they are paired with managing distress and humanizing children.
Right.
If we humanize children and we don't manage distress, that's where we are containing a child who's showing us that she's unwell. But I think in general, the principles, if you know about Pavlov's dog, they ring the bell and the dogs drool because they know it's time to eat. There's a lot of parallels in behaviorism too.
Yeah, I mean, it's heavily behaviorism.
Yeah.
It's right there in the name. Kind of, but
so people are often kind of familiar with the principles, even if they have not seen it in action.
Yeah.
So the way I think about it in the classroom is it's focusing on the behavior, not why the child might be doing that. Like a child's asking for help, it might be because they can't do it on their own, or it's too stressful to do it on their own and they want help. Or I could just focus on the behavior of they're talking to me while I'm trying to do something else. and this behavior has to stop. I need to figure out a way to stop it. So I only view it, it's like you're only viewing it from the adult perspective and just the behavior itself, and not what is that behavior communicating to me? What, or they're asking, what could I do differently to alleviate? And I think stress is I don't know, as a teacher, I like to think of it as stress. Like if a child who normally puts on their coat can't do it that day, and they're just, oh, help me, and they fall to the ground, it seems like they're kind of stressed. And I actually find that if I say, wow, you just don't have it in you to put on the coat today, huh? Do you want some help? They'll often do it they'll do most of the work anyway.
Yeah. Jump up.
Whereas if I
join you.
Had said, and I think I probably did this when I first started teaching, like, you can put it on, and that they would have just gone further into their upsetness or whatever, like, it would have been a lot more work for me and for them. Like, neither of us would be happy. We would both be more stressed. And all I had to do is recognize that stress, or that's not all, but I think a lot of times, like co-regulation, to me, the first step is to acknowledge that the child is going through a difficult thing, and depending how dysregulated they are, sometimes that's all they need to hear. If it's something like the coat, obviously there are other times when,
and if it's in the early stage of the interaction, like once they've reached the point, like the little girl who didn't want to do the weather, that sort of logical thinking, decision-making part of her brain is not the one that's in control, the part that's in control. It's those survival mode of fight or flee or fawn or whatever they all are, and holding her and containing her and adding to the stress isn't going to bring her into the state she needs to be to do whatever it is you're asking her to do. So
that story was fascinating to me because there's multiple things happening there that I see happen all the time. But my first question is, like, we probably do the weather every day, but like, does this child know what it means to do the weather? Because I actually don't. So, I mean, not to nitpick, but A, let's be clear about what we're asking.
Sure. Yeah.
And then B, as they were trying to get her to do the weather, it sounds like a lot of other things happened that then it became like, I can't remember what the other directives were, but whoever was with her pivoted multiple times to sort of like distractors that she had thrown in the process to avoid doing. And they just, I mean,
she dumped Legos and they wanted her to pick them up and do the weather.
Yeah. And I was like, if what you really want is for her to do the weather, why are you following these distractions? Ignore the Legos.
Right.
And it's just interesting. I think I was trained up in behavioral enough environment that I can see that too. And I'm like, well, you're not following through. Like, why should she do the weather?
Yeah. Right. But I mean, honestly, the adults' brain is engaged in the wrong spot in that moment too, and they both need the co-regulation. The co-regulation isn't always just for the child. Sometimes it's for both of us to get back into a spot where we can really move forward.
And we have to bring in Dan's voice here, because just the idea of doing the weather,
what the hell?
He would say, what the hell? Like, just go outside if you want to know the weather.
The weather's outside.
Weather isn't something you do, it's something you experience.
Yep.
And you're in a classroom, so you're not experiencing it.
Yeah.
It's like the most abstract thing you could do. And Dan was a friend of ours, often on the show, and he passed away 2
years ago.
A year and a half ago. It was in August.
So.
So we always
said what the hell about a lot of things. Yeah. A lot of things like that. But I mean, I think that's another important thing, is like looking at the goal that you're having the fight over, because essentially that's what you're doing. You're having a fight with a child over whether they want to go put the sweater on the teddy bear or whatever the weather was in that moment. And is that really worth the rupture of the relationship and the stress that it's causing both of you in that moment?
I'm not infallible, right? And so
that's not what Mike said when we agreed to have you on the show.
We notoriously only have infallible people on.
Right. Yes.
No, but the phrase I will use is often like, is that the hill you want to die on?
Yeah.
When I'm, supervising and coaching people, I'm like, if this is really important to you, die on that hill. That's fine.
Mhm.
And then for myself, I will have occasionally found myself dying on hills with children where I'm like, oh no, I'm dying on a hill.
Oh no. Yes. How did I get here?
Sometimes like you just get emotionally engaged in whatever is happening. A child like snatches somebody else's teddy bear and the kid with the teddy bear had just finally calmed down, and everything in me is just like so mad about the injustice of it that I'm like, you can't take his teddy bear, and then I see myself just dying on the hill.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I almost did that today with these kids dancing to the Blue Danube. They had just done it with like a music teacher, and they all like had so much fun. But then they were like, just 3 kids were just like knocking into each other. And
Mhm.
I am known for usually allowing that.
The Blue
But
Danube
I was trying to
mosh
do it
pit.
with some other kids. Yeah, it was exactly the Strauss mosh pit. The Strauss pit. Strauss
Yes.
pit. Yeah.
Yeah. It'll come
But
to
there
you.
were some other kids that, were having fun doing it. So we're doing it. And the other kids are kind of getting a little,
Yeah.
like the mosh pit was coming into the other part. And I started to say something and realized what I was doing. So luckily I caught myself and just said, yeah, just try to keep that on this side. so they can still see
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
picture. There's this visual that went along with it, right? So the other
Yeah.
kids are trying to see the picture.
I
So
see.
Yeah. But I did, like, it was one of those ones where had I been just a little more stressed, and it could have been stressed from something totally different.
Mhm.
Or if it had been like, if I hadn't eaten breakfast, for
Yeah.
instance, that stress, I probably would have said more.
Mhm.
Like, we are not, moshing right now.
We don't mosh our friends.
We don't mosh our friends. That
Yep.
reminds me, one time I did play Napalm Death to preschoolers.
You did what?
I played Napalm Death to some preschoolers.
Oh yeah.
I did this whole radio show about like just playing different music to kids and see how they react.
Oh yeah.
And Napalm Death, they all just started running around in a circle and jump on each other.
Nice.
And it was like, wow, it's just there.
Yeah. Start Wearing Purple was ours.
Yeah. Oh, that was definitely yeah.
Anyway,
we do go in tangents. Yeah.
Yes,
ABA.
Yeah. So again, I was just sort of talking about this in my class on Saturday, and I was talking about ABA and specifically the study that the Department of Defense did that sort of found some flaws in the basic research that ABA is based on. Because they're the country's largest insurer. And that was where they were paying so much for ABA services. They did this study and they found that there were some pretty essential flaws in the research backing up ABA. And I was just sharing that as you might want to look more into this if you're curious about it, but it just opened this whole thing because ABA is the only thing we've got in town if you've got a child with autism. And it's the only thing insurance will pay for. And then they want you in there for 30 hours a week. And it's a messy thing. But I feel like that doesn't mean we don't talk about it. It means we get more people talking about it so that maybe we can figure something else out.
Totally. And I struggle with it a lot because I think systemically we have a major failure and a major injustice happening on a system. I also know that like some of the most brilliant people I know I met in, ABA type of settings. And my question is like, as you know better, do you do better? And
or different?
Yeah.
When you know better, do you do different?
Yeah. And, but I'm regularly in consultation with families who, are moving out of state and they're like, I don't, the only programs that are available are these kinds of programs. And I feel compelled not to tell families not to get services.
Right.
And so what I will say is like, if you find yourself in an ABA situation, what I want you to do is just monitor the quality of the relationship with the therapist. How does your child respond to them? How do you feel in that relationship, because a lot of the research around any mental health service says like, you gotta like your therapist,
Mhm.
most part, or at least respect them enough to try the stuff. And that's the same if your child is 2 as if you're, 72. And so, I have a lot of questions about the model, but at the end of the day, I think like if we can look at distress and look at the quality of the relationship and remember that children learn in the context of like positive nurturing
Mhm.
relationships with adults, I'm like, maybe we can mitigate some harm.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. That's good advice. Um,
I threw around, the eugenics word earlier.
yeah. Yeah.
And here I am being like, but maybe like if it's, maybe if
I
they're
know. I was like, do I want to
uh,
bring conversion therapy into this conversation? Because I think it's the same guy, right? Is conversion therapy and ABA kind of the same
There's one
guy?
person in common. I had the name up just a second ago.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if I was going to go there
It's
either.
like, but Anna already said eugenics, so maybe that's enough.
Ole Ivar Lovas, I
Yeah.
think is the name.
Yeah.
But yeah, he definitely thought that I don't know, this report says he's often referred to as the founder of ABA.
Mhm.
I have no clue if that's true or totally true, but it
Yeah.
does seem like conversion therapy, that is, in a way, maybe it is easier for me to understand in a way, because that's done with adults. So if an adult has an attraction to someone of the same gender, this idea of conversion therapy is looking at the behavior. Oh, this person wants to have sex with another person of the same gender. We don't like that behavior. We are going to do everything we can to stop that.
Mhm.
And it doesn't matter if it's abusive. It doesn't matter if it's coercive. It doesn't get to the root of it. Was what if we let them?
Yeah. What if it's just okay that
Like, it's actually very similar, right? And I think the same thing with ABA, like the idea of stimming, right?
Mhm.
Like, the more I realize about myself and like, oh, I do a lot of things that are stimming behaviors. I'm still in the process of finding out, like, do I call it stimming? I don't know, but
Right.
I know that I can't pay attention after a while, and I get kind of stressed if I'm not moving my body. And I don't see, how preventing a person from moving their body in ways just because it's making other people
Mhm.
uncomfortable. Because and in my head, that's the way I think of ABA, right? Like, why
Right.
would that be the thing, the hill you want to die on,
Yeah.
right? I need you to stop flapping your arms. Versus, so my own child is autistic, and I remember we went to see Rent. Here's another tangent for you. Went to see Rent, and they do this thing where you can do a lottery to get a $20 ticket. So we went. My child got front row center, tickets. So they go up there, and they were like, I don't remember what year it was. They were like 15 maybe.
Mhm.
And they turned to the people next to them and said, just so you know, I'm autistic. When I get excited, I'm going to be moving my hands. I'm fine. Don't call the usher over here.
Uh-huh.
I'm not actually.
Yeah.
And so then they just were doing this, like knocking their knuckles together for the entire show.
Uh-huh.
And they were like bruised and stuff. And then,
but they were so happy.
yeah, and we stayed for the question and answer afterwards with the
Uh-huh.
cast. And there was a cast member, now I forget which role, but they were saying something about the thing about doing it live is sometimes you look out in the audience and you see someone who is so excited, and it just
Oh.
drives it up. And they looked right at Remus, the child, like they
Yeah.
knew. Remus didn't notice, but
Yeah.
it's like they're talking about you. But it was just amazing. But like, that's the thing I want someone to teach, an
Mhm.
autistic child, is how do you advocate?
Right.
Like, my child didn't really use an IEP until I think like senior year maybe.
Mhm.
And it was because they were always in schools where it was like, we had a 504 one, so it wasn't like, but it was mostly that they would just say, hey, can I sit over there? the light,
Mhm.
whereas here the light's right in my eyes, or I need to be against a wall. There can't be sound behind me, whatever. And they would just say it, and the teacher would say, okay. But I remember briefly when they were at a school that was bigger and, followed more rules, it was like,
Mhm.
you can't wear a hat in school. And my child would have, just like a winter hat that would cover their ears
Mhm.
to sort of dull some of the sharper sounds.
Mhm.
And they were like, no. And, and it's that thing of, we have to get a variance or whatever,
To wear a hat.
IEP to wear a hat, and it's like, how, like, I wouldn't even need a reason,
Mhm.
for a kid who's telling you, I can't pay attention to you talking if I don't have my ears covered,
Mhm.
you know? So they started wearing, headphones instead, which still not sure why that was
Say
better,
that
but
was better. And that was okay. All right. Probably because it's on a list of adaptive equipment
yeah,
that's
that's
approved or
true,
something.
true,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Well, we've got ourselves all good and wound up, fired up about it.
I love that red
And
story.
we're
I feel
in.
like
Yeah.
that's gorgeous.
Yeah.
yeah.
What should
Yeah.
we leave with? What should we end with? What now?
So what does someone do? Because I think a lot of the listeners are,
Yeah, we've got 5
classroom
minutes left.
teachers.
What should they do instead?
Well, no, but I mean,
It
just the
doesn't have to be
hopeful
5
part,
minutes.
right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what does therapy look like, or what should a teacher do in a classroom that's not just that being on the battle, right? I
Power
guess
struggle.
so. We have Karen at work talks about not this, but this. So how do we do? Have you ever seen her do that?
That's great.
Yeah.
No, I don't think I have. Surprisingly, Mike, she's actually never had to say that to me.
Anna, before you yell at Mike, do we really want this?
Yeah.
So what do we do? I mean, I think the balance I'm always trying to strike. Well, I think first, as human adults working with children, running it past how would I experience this if I was in this child's shoes is like a pretty solid strategy.
Yeah.
Just in general, like
yeah, you don't need to go to a workshop for that. You don't
Yeah.
need you don't need the special certification. Just ask
Yeah.
yourself that.
Like
Yeah.
if you were really upset and somebody picked you up and yelled at you and then, made you pick up all your Legos, like, would you want to do it? And then also the idea that because of course we have to have boundaries, right? We can't really have fun if we don't have real safety and like real boundaries. But when we have boundaries, if you have hills that you truly have to die on, I use the example of like children running into the street. I'm not going to follow the child's lead on that. I'm going to try, and I'm going to be like, that's scary. But we can still relate, right? We can still validate. We can still be like, you were so excited about that squirrel across the street, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I think where we really have to be directive, we can still be human and we can still relate to the child's experience and like work to reduce distress. It doesn't have to be, I see these two sort of ideas take hold, either like, oh, so we just let him do whatever he wants.
Right. Yeah.
We're constantly directing him at every single turn. And I'm like, no, I think there's really an opportunity for both.
When I was looking up quotes for today, I was reading Lisa Murphy's book, the one about being child-centered or whatever that one's called.
It's called On Being Child-Centered.
There we go. I was pretty close.
Yeah, you got it.
But she, and I think she was even quoting someone else, but she said, children don't push boundaries because they want to break the rules. They push boundaries to see where they are, or to make sure where they know where they are, so they feel comfortable. And I thought, that's such a great reframe. Because she was talking similarly, like, right, when people think of child-centered, like, oh, you just let them do whatever. It's like, well, no one's hitting another child over the head with a chair, and but
Yeah.
the example I used earlier, when three kids are cracking up as they bump into each other, why would I stop that? As
Yeah.
long as the one thing I did stop was, oh, these three want to look at this, piece of paper here.
Mhm.
That was it,
Yeah.
so there was a limit,
Mhm.
but I didn't have to put in the limit of, it is not, we are not moshing to Strauss, like that, so
Yeah.
I guess that's the difference in a way, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
I didn't mean to take it away. Like, I feel like, Anna, you should have the last word. I shouldn't have.
Yeah, go ahead and say a last word.
Be brilliant.
Be
We're
brilliant. Go.
the Strauss really can't be topped.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the episode title. We'll see how this plays out. See what you say next, Anna. You've got one chance to get the episode title.
No, I think that's really excellent. And there was one other thing I was thinking of.
Yeah.
I can't be profound, and it won't top We're Not Moshing to Strauss.
Okay.
But the other thing I think about is we want to let the children do the thinking, right? Like, let the children do the thinking.
Mhm.
So, if I'm properly caffeinated, I've had enough sleep, and like I'm in a really good mood, if the children are moshing to Strauss, I might pause them and I might be like, hey, so I see that those kids actually don't want to mosh to Strauss right now. What can we do? And they'll probably figure it out, and they'll probably figure it on their own. And I think sometimes when we get super directive with kids, then they don't get to do the thinking, and we're more annoying. And so if we can let kids do the thinking, even if it is to enforce a boundary, they're usually pretty good at fixing problems.
Mm-hmm. Especially when our stated goal is almost always, well, they need to learn to ... Then letting them do some of the thinking is really a valuable approach.
And that idea that early childhood teachers often use around regulation, like regulating the kid, is exactly that, right? Taking away their thinking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Ooh.
Don't take away their thinking.
There you go. There's a new one. New episode title, episode total, whichever you prefer. All right. This was really a good conversation. I had so much fun and learned some things. And I think it's going to give people a lot to think about as they're listening to it. So thank you both for coming on and doing this. And thanks everybody for listening to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd.